After Republicans overperformed in New York State's midterms elections last year, many of the mainstream media jumped to blame a, quote, suburban revolt over crime and quality of life. However, according to writer Matthew Thomas, it's just not true. Outcomes in New York City, more specifically in Asian and Hispanic neighborhoods, were the real culprit. In fact, between 2018 and 2022 alone, majority Hispanic and majority Asian precincts swung over 40 points rightwards.
Will Democrats survive the looming crisis in New York City's outer boroughs? Author of the Vulgar Marxism Substack, Matt Thomas, joins us now to expand on his reporting. Nice to see you again. Welcome back.
Thanks, Robbie. Good to be here.
So what does your reporting tell us on, what was going on in this election with the changing consensus around crime? We've had a lot of debates about whether that's, motivating people to switch Republican, or whether we were just losing progressive or leftist voters by, kind of talking with a right of center framework about crime and culture, some other things, without actually picking anyone up.
I actually don't know. Part of what is interesting about these trends in New York City, so just to give zoom out a little bit, I've been looking at trends in majority Hispanic and majority Asian neighborhoods in New York City, beginning with the 2020 presidential election, continuing to the 2021 mayoral election, and then in this past governor's race. And in all three races, you've seen a marked swing towards the GOP in both of those categories, and among majority white precincts as well. And so you see this continuing swing to the right over the past three election cycles. And while it's certainly true that issues of crime and public safety have figured somewhat into, certainly in the last election and even in the mayoral race, it was somewhat less of a major theme in 2020, although it was there also. It wasn't the sort of uniform focus of the media coverage of that race, but yet you see the same pattern. So I actually think that both sides kind of overstate the impact of coverage of crime and even other public policy issues. And both sides have an interest in sort of stating that, right? On the one hand, the left likes to sort of chide, they like to create boogeymen out of, the suburban white moderate, who they like to blame for the failures of the left and the Democratic Party more generally. And then centrists and right of center people like to say, yes, actually, all the things that we've been saying about out of control crime and lack of public safety are correct, and that's why voters are coming to us. But I kind of suspect that there are actually other factors at play that are national in scope, much more deep-seated and not really related to the particular news cycles of each election cycle.
So help me understand then, because what you're describing as a trend, I believe specifically among Asian American and Hispanic households in New York to the right. What do we know or not know with respect to qualitative data as to what is motivating that specific trend? And I believe I heard you say that it's a more significant trend now than it was in 2020, despite crime also being a pretty significant issue, obviously, in the context of 2020 and the George Floyd protests and all of that. So what is going on there? Because also I'm old enough to remember when the story of AOC's victory in the Bronx in 2018 was partly a story about how she had mobilized younger, white, gentrifying DSA members to knock doors and turn people out for her in a low turnout district, whereas her predecessor, Joe Crowley, his source of power was largely in Asian communities in Queens, and that she was able to overcome that like stranglehold that he had because of turnout in other parts of the city. So there's a lot of unexpected demographic narratives going on here. What do we intuit from the shift rightward among specifically Asian Americans and Hispanics?
Yeah, there's a few points there to make. Number one is that it is interesting that in Queens, you do see in general elections this shift towards the right among minority voters, basically. But yet you also see a lot of success of socialist candidates in Queens in particular. I mean, I live in Western Queens, and we now have 4 overlapping DSA-endorsed candidates: state assembly, state senate, Congress, and city council. But I actually don't think it's a contradiction at all. What it tells me is that there is a huge collapse of institutional capacity with the local democratic machine and party infrastructure. And so in the context of primaries, that allows challenges from the left to succeed when you have robust infrastructure on the left. And when the left isn't, duking it out in general elections, because we've won in these safe districts in the primary, the party struggles against Republicans. So I actually think it makes a lot of sense. But in terms of the qualitative data, certainly what you hear is that people are concerned about, crime and quality of life and public safety. Minority areas are typically the most impacted by crime and violent crime of all types. And so people do express, when you ask people to articulate what are the reasons they're moving to the right, those are the types of things that they say. Also with Asian communities in particular, issues of education are highly important. In New York City, we have specialized high schools, which are like selective admission institutions, and they're Asian students are typically overrepresented relative to the population because they work very hard, and there's a huge focus in those immigrant communities on education. And those are typically, Asian immigrants. They're some of them are the wealthiest immigrant groups in New York City, but also some of the deepest poverty among immigrant communities in New York City is among Asian communities. So it really depends. And a lot of those people who come from poor and working class backgrounds in these Asian immigrant communities really rely on education and center that as sort of the means of achieving upward mobility. And there's a fear that Democrats are not being responsive to upholding educational quality and integrity in the city. And so that's another big reason that people talk about also. But I would just say that while that all may be true, I also think that people articulate reasons for their movements in the moment in response to current events, but they may be, in fact, driven by more, things that they don't understand. Not that they don't understand, but like, for example, non-college whites have been moving rightward since the 60s, and they could say it's in relation to this or that issue, but really, it's the same trend over many decades, even though the issues change. And so my kind of hot take is that you're just seeing all non-college voters move to the right now, and that it's jumped the racial barrier. And that more than anything is what we're seeing.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to ask about that. Nationally, we talk about the salience of race decreasing and the salience of both income and educational attainment increasing, so that the more educated, the wealthier voters are moving toward the Democratic Party, whereas all voters, regardless of race, who don't fall into those categories, moving toward the Republican Party, which might produce, would you argue, is producing very interesting phenomenons in places like New York City, where you have a lot of immigrant communities then not voting, or maybe voting overall in a general differently than a primary for that reason.
Yes, I mean, I think that's exactly what's happening. The one exception I would note is black voters. There's some movement to the right year over year, but ultimately, when you compare it to the movement in Asian and Hispanic communities, it's really negligible. And so that's a very interesting phenomenon. There's a lot to say about, there are different interpretations of that also in terms of who the right wing is able to reach out to in terms of this realignment and what are the limits of that. But I definitely agree that, I think that this shift will continue into the future. As I've said, we've seen, I look at specifically at New York City in the past 3 election cycles, state, local, and federal level, 3 in a row, you see the same trend, and it's just downward trajectory of Asian and Hispanic voters away from the Dems and towards the GOP. It's difficult to know. Nobody wants to be in the prediction game anymore these days, but there's no reason to think that trend won't continue. Just as an example, like in 2018, in heavily Hispanic enclaves, precincts that are more than 75% Hispanic, Cuomo got 90% of the vote in those precincts, and Hochul got in the 60s. It's just massive over, in one cycle. And that would have been, if you had said that to people 4 years ago, they'd been like, what are you talking about? That's inconceivable. So people are like, well, why would it continue going in that direction? Well, why wouldn't it? It's come this far.
And you're saying that's a trend that's happening. And what we'll now do is try to say, well, that's because of X, Y, Z reason. Cuomo had his scandal, or maybe Hochul's not popular. Nobody ever chose her. She was just elected.
Name
but you're saying
on
that's
Cuomo
not true.
Is the name recognition. I mean, it is difficult to disentangle the specifics of what's happening here. Cuomo is its political legacy, and comparing it to Hochul, who kind of stepped into his position midstream, I would imagine. It doesn't necessarily surprise me that there's that huge gap between the two of them.
It's true, and so there's that, which is why I think you have to look at, you can then compare it to 2021. You see the same trend also with Eric Adams and Curtis Sliwa, and the trend is there also. Even though Eric Adams, I specifically look at Hispanic communities in Queens. Eric Adams was the borough president of Brooklyn. Like in these super high, Hispanic dense neighborhoods in Queens, there's probably not going to be a huge connection there, and yet you still see this movement. But for example, in 2014, which as we know is a huge red wave year. I mean, rock bottom turnout. The turnout in New York City that year was 21%. I mean, just couldn't get worse. And Cuomo still won 83% of the vote in majority Hispanic enclaves, and Hochul won 66. Even though turnout was 15 points higher in New York City this year than it was in 2014. So, you do see these trends. Certainly Hochul, I think it's certainly fair to say that she does not have the same oomph and the same legacy and the same sort of command of the electorate. But the bulk of how dramatic the trends are suggests to me an underlying issue.
Well, Matt Thomas, thank you for bringing that analysis to Rising. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
And we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us.